Good afternoon. With the use of medical devices skyrocketing at a 62% rate over the next 5 years, patients and hospitals face a huge risk. Cyber attacks have already struck a whopping 95% of healthcare organizations, and their patient care has been held hostage until they pay a ransom. The average cost to a hospital of any kind of data breach is more than $2 million. So just think about how many devices can be connected to one patient, then multiply that by the number of patients in your hospital or clinic, and the potential exposure is exponential. I'm Zmuda, Senior Networks Director for Vizient. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by 3 leading experts in healthcare cybersecurity to see how hospitals can safeguard medical devices, and we'll specifically discuss the role of supply chain professionals in this process. Our learning objectives today are to identify the threats and costs to medical device cybersecurity, to examine how to make medical devices more secure, and we'll also review examples from Vizient members who have advanced medical device cybersecurity in their organizations. Just a quick reminder that we've allotted additional time for today's program, 1 hour, and that is specifically so that we can answer your questions and you can participate in this discussion. So to ask a question, just type it in the box at the bottom of your screen and click submit, and we'll respond to those questions live in the course of this program and toward the end. So let's meet our experts. Erick, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Molly. Pleasure to meet you. I am the Chief Information Security Officer as well as the Chief Privacy Officer for the University of Chicago Medicine. I'm also the industry lead for the development of the health industry cybersecurity practices, or what we like to affectionately call HICCUP. And I'm also a member of the Executive Council for the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council.
Excellent. Thank you for being here. Kevin, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Kevin McDonald. I'm a Director of Clinical Information Security at the Mayo Clinic. I have over 35 years experience in healthcare. One point that has helped me quite a bit is I actually started as a bedside nurse. I have a degree in nursing and worked as a registered nurse. One of the other groups that I also take care of at Mayo is I've got 12 people who are dedicated to medical device security. And I'm also a co-chair for the Joint Security Plan, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later.
Excellent, and great perspective. And Greg, can you round us out?
Thank you, Molly. Good to be here.
Yeah.
I'm Greg Garcia. I'm the Executive Director for Cybersecurity of the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council, which is a coalition of more than 200 healthcare institutions working together to solve cybersecurity problems. Rather than as a practitioner from an individual institution, I look at this from a national policy perspective, having served in similar roles with the financial services community, with the information technology community, as well as with the Department of Homeland Security.
Excellent. An important perspective for today's discussion considering the magnitude of this issue, so thanks for being here. All right, Erick, so let's start with the challenge, which is no small challenge, but specifically tell us about the threats of cybersecurity with a focus on patient safety and, specifically related to medical devices.
Yeah, so it's interesting to note that I think we've all faced issues related to cybercrime. So think about some moments in your past where you might have gotten a letter due to your information had been compromised by an organization. Perhaps it was some sort of tax fraud case, or maybe you got one of those alerts on your credit card because a fraudulent charge had been taken out. These are things that we're all very familiar with these days. Those types of attacks have started about over 20 years ago, and it's it's important to note that criminals will always be around. And in the past, the criminals have sort of taken a physical approach to this, and today they're still doing that, as well as going into the digital space. So within healthcare, the challenges that we face are around confidentiality and privacy. So if you think about when you go to get a loan taken out from a bank, you're filling in all of that information about your history, your mother's maiden name, your address. Well, you do all of that when you come to the hospital as well, and more. You're filling in your insurance information, you're filling in your credit card information to pay for it, and then you're getting brought into the system. And of course, so all of that is obviously around the privacy side of the house. Well, the unique aspect within healthcare is the patient safety risks that arise. So today, we have devices that are connected to patients in a lot of different ways, and these devices are connected onto networks. And the concerns that we're thinking about is related to the attacks against these devices. But let's just go back in history a little bit. So 20 years ago, the things that we were concerned about were credit card fraud, identity theft. And the types of individuals who were conducting these attacks were skilled attackers, but the resources that they had available to them were things that they had to have themselves. They had to gather this information, to gather their resources, their computers, their toolkits that they used to conduct these attacks. Well, 10 years ago, the underground economy got born into life. The dark web emerges, essentially, and this all originated from organized crime. So as the crime syndicates come together, they realize that there's a lot of money to be had in this space around the theft of this information, and that was 10 years ago. So today, you still have people that are obviously wanting to commit these types of attacks. Maybe they don't have the resources available to them or the know-how. They might not even know how to conduct a cyber attack. And so today in the underground markets, you have things like hacking as a service. So me as an individual who has no idea how to hack, I could just go out there and buy a hacker, rent a hacker's time for 2 or 3 or 4 hours at a specific price point. And that's pretty alarming, it's pretty scary. So as we pivot, though, into the healthcare industry, our journey has been a bit of a different, on a different time scale than the hackers. We've been a little bit behind. In 2005, the HIPAA security rule was released, and this is when the regulations came along and stated that we had to protect the information associated to our patients, the privacy side again, as we discussed earlier. But it didn't have teeth behind it. So there was an obligation that we had to do this, but there was no notifications or other expectations. In 2009, the HITECH Act was released, and with this particular act came the breach notification clauses. So if a healthcare institution got breached and got compromised, now they're obligated to tell the patients what happened, what to do to protect themselves, and potentially face monetary penalties from the regulators, or in this case specifically the Office of Civil Rights. So the focus, though, still, in all of these cases, is largely on the privacy side of the house. We haven't talked about the patient safety issues. I think some of that changed. I mean, us cybersecurity individuals, we've been talking about this for quite some time. We think about all the stuff that can go wrong. And when the media and the general community started to get a sense of like what this could entail, I'd like to go to the moment in 2012. For those who are Homeland, who watched the show Homeland on Showtime, there was an episode that appeared in, I believe, the second season called Broken Hearts. And so, apologies, spoilers, if you haven't seen Homeland, I'm going to give away something here. But the vice president in this show, he had a pacemaker, an embedded pacemaker inside of him. And they assassinated him by hacking the pacemaker and causing these electric shocks to occur. And that just sort of caused this big major social commentary about, can this actually happen? Is this just Hollywood, stating that this is an issue, or is this a real problem? And since that time in 2012 to today, just 7 years later, we are really having some serious conversations about this. So just to recap, the big issues that we talked about here, obviously the beginning, the thing that we're all most familiar with is fraud and identity theft and how the health systems are part of that. And obviously the patient safety concerns associated to these medical devices. But let's also not forget, we'll discuss on this later, the fact that extortion of our digital environments or ransoms to our digital environments can also be an area of patient harm.
Got it. Great background, great grounding. So Kevin, are these threats to patient safety real?
Well, it's interesting to go back to your Homeland example. We are now getting alerts from the Department of Homeland Security about pacemaker vulnerabilities and things that healthcare organizations have to do, and including vendors having to put out some software releases to be able to fix those. If you look in the industry, 18% of IT execs say that they have had a medical device compromised. The question now is, has there been a patient harm? And if there was, would we even know it? One of the issues is that there's really no review of devices after you have a patient issue. When an adverse event occurs in a hospital, There's a whole set of processes that go on from mortality, morbidity conferences, forensics. But right now, those rarely, if ever, include taking a look at the devices that were involved with that patient. People keep saying, well, that's never happened before. Well, we're constantly surprised in an era of where we have a whole bunch of firsts in cybersecurity. Everything from the Wannacry from the National Health System, the ransomware which shut them down for multiple days and just really stopped patient care, to the issues that we've had with Equifax, where pretty much everybody in the whole United States now has their credit report breached, or even the Office of Personnel Management, where millions upon millions of digital fingerprints have been stolen.
Yeah, this issue of Wannacry and ransomware, it's a strange word, Wannacry and not Petra. Where do they get these names? But this is generally what we call ransomware, where a hacker can get into a hospital system, lock everything down, put a sign up on the computer and says, I'm sorry, your data has been hacked. And to get it back, you need to deposit $40,000 in Bitcoin into the dark web in order to get it back. This happened, as one example, to a hospital in Indiana. $40,000 is what they had to pay in order to get back their patient records, their scheduling systems, their lab results, and you can't treat patients when you have no data available to you. And this is costing the hospital system $6 billion per year. And the lesson, I think, in this is that ransomware more and more can be executed in any number of ways, on the IT systems, on medical devices as a vector of attack. So for you in the supply chain profession, supply chain security is going to be a critical part of the solution to keeping ransomware attacks from happening in the first place.
Greg, I just want to point out, where did Wannacry, the name, come from? Originated from the original attack called Wannacrypt, because it was encrypting all those files, and then people who got hit with it wanted to cry, and so Wannacry was
who thought hackers don't have a sense of
right, exactly.
Of course.
There's one other thing I want to point out as it relates to this digital extortion / ransomware issues. There was a 2-doctor practice in Michigan that just recently closed. You can look this up in the news. They got hit with ransomware. They decided that they were not going to pay for the ransom. And so the attackers turned around and said, fine, if you're not going to pay for it, we're going to delete all of your information. And so they did. They lost years and years of medical information. And because there were no backups and because they didn't have, I'm assuming that they didn't have the ability to restore this, the two physicians who were close to retirement said, well, we're just going to close our practice down. And they retired. Now think about what that means to the patients who they were being cared for there. They don't have their history of information there anymore. And so they're going to have to restart as they go over and find another clinician, another provider.
It's really, I just keep coming back to the term unsettling. You can't really attribute the issue, the risk at the scale that exists within our industry is just so significant. So Kevin, how are providers mobilizing to anticipate the threat?
Well, the healthcare industry right now is, as all of you know, you might be in one of the lucky hospitals that's really doing financially well. A significant number are having difficulty. I think there's 600 smaller hospitals out there that are financially vulnerable. So it's tough to respond to this right now, particularly in small rural areas, critical access hospitals where you may not have another hospital for another 30 minutes to an hour away from there. Healthcare industry spends about 4 to 6% of their IT budget on security. That's as opposed to financial industry, which is about 12 to 15% of their IT budget. Realizing that the IT budget in financial industry is even bigger than it is in healthcare. So those numbers actually are a little even misleading. And about 60% of the healthcare execs really are not confident in their medical device security strategy. And again, to be able to respond to this, some of them are building it into their cybersecurity program, some are building it into their disaster recovery, some into their IT, a lot of it into their supply chain. But again, it's tough for hospitals to respond to this where they have your average hospital is 160 beds, 10.7 million NOI, and to properly respond to a lot of this can sometimes take more than that just to tool up to be able to manage it.
So the threat is real, and it's here, it's been here. What are those basic assumptions about medical device cybersecurity that our audience should make starting today, if they haven't already?
Yeah, the days, for those of you who've been in healthcare for a while, the days of it's okay, we have a firewall are over. Really, you have to assume that all networks are inherently insecure, and that you have to have multiple layers of defense, which continue all the way down, particularly the medical devices, so that they're secure by design. And you'll hear that quite a bit. And that means that that device can pretty much stand on its own. Some of the areas where you can have the greatest impact on security are some pretty simple things. Having an inventory of your devices and software, patching those operating systems, limiting the software that runs on the system, whitelisting antivirus, no default, password, hard-coded passwords. Do you have enterprise strategies that healthcare needs to explore on this, making sure that you have network segmentation? None of these these are all things, the top things in particular, are really things that you would do for your home computer, your home technology, if it was managed well. And we have to change our thinking too. We have to also start thinking of, as we go through a list of things that might have happened in the hospital, we need to add a bullet point front to it might have been a cybersecurity issue.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, and the issue about awareness and understanding and information, sometimes we know what we should know, sometimes we don't know what we should know, and the worst case is we don't know what we don't know. And to get through that, some of the best fidelity that we have from information relating to attacks is stakeholder information sharing. One of the most robust ways to share that information, many of you may be a part of, is the ISAC community, Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. These are collaboratives of healthcare institutions that are sharing information about threats, about vulnerabilities, and about attacks, and what they've done about them. And this information is shared not just within the healthcare sector, within the ISACs, but also with government. We have very good government partners in the Department of Health and Human Services, HC3, maybe you've heard of, the Healthcare Cyber Coordination Center, or the Department of Homeland Security's Industrial Control Systems, CERT, the Computer Emergency Readiness Team. For example, there's a chat going on right now, just today, in the Health ISAC, where providers and medical device companies are asking themselves, comparing notes on is there utility in some of these security certifications for medical devices for the purposes of audit or for FDA approval? And they're learning from each other. And so with some of this kind of information and forensics coming from cyber attacks, we can go beyond FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that way we can get to some of the root cause analysis of what's happening and what should we be doing about it.
Yeah, and Greg, we talk about root cause, we talk about morbidity and mortality conferences. There's a real challenge here to understand when a device malfunctions. Is the device malfunctioning because of a hardware issue, because of a software issue, because it was used improperly, or was it because of a cyber issue? Kevin mentioned this earlier. And these devices just don't have, generally speaking, the capability of producing logs that are necessary to conduct forensics so you can actually determine what happened. So to Kevin's point earlier, these M&M conferences, that we're not really getting into the root cause of an adverse event based on a patient safety outcome due to a connected medical device.
Yeah, you have to think of medical devices really, if you tear everything away, it's really just a special use case of a bad computer. That computer controls most of the things that are happening as far as the care. And so we're now in an area of cybersecurity throughout all of healthcare. And a lot of these things are vulnerable. These computers, though, they may be controlling things like hardware that either supports life, supports care process, provides diagnostic information. you still have to worry about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of a device. But many times the impact is higher since there's a patient on the other end of this computer. And quite frankly, there's some patient care which can just no longer be supported without technology. The example is in neonatal ICU, some of those babies are a kilogram. And so some of the medications are used to titrate in like micrograms per kilogram per minute. And without an infusion pump and the ability to be able to very precisely dial in that medication, you have chances of poor patient outcomes.
Right. So, Greg, the issue is bigger than any, as Kevin said, 160-bed average size healthcare provider organization. It's bigger than any one device manufacturer. It really requires public and private collaboration. So tell us a bit about the partnership that has emerged through the Health Sector Coordinating Council.
Absolutely. Thank you, Molly. Institutions like University of Chicago and Mayo Clinic, I mean, they're at the top of their game. They know how to do cybersecurity, but that isn't enough because we are in an interconnected system. We are part of this ecosystem in the healthcare industry that involves not just hospital institutions, but medical device makers and plans and payers, pharmaceuticals, and public health and health IT. And they're all part of a value chain. And unless we are working together to deal with these cross-cutting cybersecurity threats, then we're not going to be effective enough. None of us is as smart individually as all of us collectively. The Health Sector Coordinating Council is organized around that principle, that we are a community of interest. The Health Sector Council is one of 16 critical infrastructure sectors designated by the government that the public depends upon for their homeland security, their economic security, their public health and safety. And we need to organize around identifying those threats and vulnerabilities affecting the delivery of those assets and services, and identifying ways to mitigate those threats, to getting stronger and more resilient. So the Health Sector Coordinating Council does this by developing a 3-year sector-specific plan, and one that is very specific about certain cybersecurity threats, such as medical device security, such as hospital best practices, such as supply chain security or intellectual property. So we've developed a number of task groups focused on very specific deliverables that we hope will move the needle in terms of our security and resiliency. And the main point to keep in mind for you is that the Sector Coordinating Council is here to think about the long term, the strategic, the policy-oriented. How do we get ahead of the threats? Versus the ISACs that are there, they're the front lines. They are doing the blocking and tackling 24/7, watch, warning, and incident response. But together we make up two sides of the same critical infrastructure coin.
And a lot of these things that we're talking about here are, the example I always like to give is, West Park Hospital in Cody, Wyoming. It's 24 beds. The only reason it's probably still open is because of all the rodeo injuries. It has a very booming orthopedic practice. Those are the ones that really benefit from a lot of this work. They're 25 beds. It's a critical access hospital. The next healthcare is 25 miles away. To be able to have these types of deliverables, artifacts that they can just take, they can then start using, and with moderate amount of effort and process changes, being able to integrate into their daily processes.
And I just want to reiterate, you guys touched on this in your introductions, but Eric, both you and Kevin are participating in all of that work. So on behalf of our viewers today, thank you for all your contributions. So Greg, is it working? What's emerging from the Cybersecurity Task Force?
Yes, and I would like to say thank you to Eric and Kevin as well, because they co-chair two of the most critical task groups within the Sector Coordinating Council. Task groups that were to deliver on recommendations from a Seminole task force that was appointed by HHS and released its report in June of 2017. It laid out 6 major imperatives for how the healthcare industry should improve its cybersecurity. And under those 6 imperatives were 24 recommendations and no fewer than 105 action items, a big to-do list for us, for the Sector Coordinating Council. But that really has served as our compass for how we're going to address these evolving cyber threats over the long term. And just to go through very briefly what some of those 6 major imperatives are. The first one is define and streamline the leadership and governance in both the healthcare industry and in government. We need to be working together, and we have to have very clearly defined roles and responsibilities for driving cybersecurity in the healthcare sector. The second is medical devices. We have to increase the resiliency and security of medical devices and the related supply chain, so that the vice president doesn't have a supply chain failure where a cyber attack leads to a heart attack. Third is we have to develop the workforce capacity necessary to do this. And that's not just the frontline IT security people working in hospitals, but it's also the clinicians and the healthcare providers and what are their responsibilities in cybersecurity in the clinical environment. The fourth one, we have to increase awareness and education throughout the healthcare sector to get everyone to understand what their specific responsibilities are in cybersecurity. Fifth is R&D and intellectual property. More and more healthcare is using all kinds of interesting new technologies for healthcare. Those introduce very compelling patient safety, patient health improvement opportunities, but they also introduce new risks. So we have to understand those. And finally, I mentioned earlier, information sharing, the ISACs, and working with government to understand threats, risks, forensics, and mitigations. So we are really focused on that. The Health Sector Cybersecurity Working Group has established, as I mentioned earlier, 13 task groups that are focused on all of those, on delivering on those recommendations. And 2 major reports that came out at the end of December and the end of January, Erick and Kevin were deeply involved with. We're going to hear more about those, but they're very important toolkits, resources for you and healthcare providers about doing the right thing in cybersecurity in hospitals and in medical devices.
This is a provider audience. They swim in a sea of regulations every day. So Kevin, tell us a bit about the regulatory environment related to medical device cybersecurity.
Well, the FDA over the last, I think the first one came out probably about 6 years or so ago, and they're working on what they call guidance, and they're trying to drive that through the industry. If you go back and you take a look at the pre-market guidance, the post-market guidance, there's actually a couple other ones that they have out there that still help as well. They're actually quite good. They give you some of the basics that need to be done. They show you some technical aspects as well. One of the things we find, though, is that there are a lot of myths out there about this FDA guidance, and the biggest thing is that it says guidance. And so there's everything from, it says guidance, I don't have to worry about this, to, you can't change a thing on a medical device without FDA approval. The reality is that it really has, it's not a if, it's a what on many of these things. And the expectation is that either it's solved away in the guidance or you have the same outcomes using some other type of method.
So guidance is a bit of a myth. Erick, tell us, tell this audience what providers can begin doing to manage the threats.
Yeah, so we actually have great resources available for you, which is fantastic. So that the same congressional mandate that required the Healthcare Industry Task Force report that Greg mentioned earlier also mandated the release of practices back to the healthcare industry. And so one of the things that I've been part of working with my colleagues in Health and Human Services and 150 members across the country was the development of HICCUP. So this is the Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices. So this guide, this cookbook, as we like to call it, ultimately identifies 5 threats within the healthcare space that we face from a cyber perspective, and then 10 practices that can help mitigate those 5 threats. Now, these 10 practices, it's a 4-volume guide. It's pretty big and verbose. It's 250 pages, so it can be kind of daunting. But we did break this up into ways that can be consumable for you so that you can actually look and find where you fit inside of the guidance. Not guidance, inside of the practices. Threat 5 is actually directly related to patient safety due to connected medical devices. So this is everything that we've been talking about, the cyber attack against a connected medical device that can cause harm to a patient. Practice 9 within the guidance is specifically geared towards how can the provider side of the equation really build up some resiliency within its spaces and increase its cybersecurity posture. There's things that we're responsible for doing for being in the provider space that we have to do. We have to segment these devices. We have to check. We have to inventory them, as Kevin was mentioning earlier. We have to make sure that all of the right antivirus is in place. We have to do the vulnerability management, et cetera. And these are things that we can't lose track of within the provider community. Also, in specifically within Practice 9, we also talk about the supply chain side of the house. And so within the supply chain piece, there's actions that we should be taking, and hopefully you as the supply chain professionals can assist us with in making sure that when we purchase these devices, we're doing it in a way that is secure. We're putting the right contract terms in place. We can hold the vendors accountable to the things that are necessary for us to obviously secure these things.
Great. So supply chain, a very strategic role and responsibility, certainly not insignificant. And of course, our supply chain leaders have a role with our vendor partners as well. So Kevin, what vendor requirements should our supply chain leaders be reminding suppliers of on a daily basis in their regular conversations?
Well, a really good start of that is what we've developed as far as the joint security plan, which really is focused at vendors, and it has some steps going through there to look at design, development, testing, and particularly for healthcare providers, there's a whole list of artifacts that we have an expectation that the vendor delivers to us. Examples are things like a software bill of material, the results of testing, what some of the security standards that were used, and again, those are things that you can just take and use yourself. Great. And many of these things can just be very quickly turned into contract language through your supply chain management. Other things that are out there is the FDA guidance. The FDA is really kind of pushing that quite a bit. Vizient is really helping quite a bit as well. We're also working with multiple healthcare delivery organizations to help push the industry that way, providing them feedback. Partnership with vendors. So the larger healthcare providers really have a lot of contact with the vendors and are quite invaluable to be able to provide them feedback on what they're going to do. Will it work in the environment? Will it impact patient care flows and processes? And it's really a combination of people at a healthcare organization. So you've got your supply chain, you've got your health technology management, you have IT you have to bring in there, you got to have security in there as well, and even the clinicians, because a lot of them are making those choices of the products. Mm-hmm. But it is a hard problem, and some of it is just the legacy part. Mm-hmm. We're going to have this problem for 10 plus years, and it's going to take billions and billions of dollars to flush the system of all of these older bad type devices. The bad part of that is HTOs now are being held responsible in both an effort and cost to put a lot of these compensating measures in place to protect some of these insecure devices. Devices that are cybersecurity insecure, but still may provide good patient care, A lot of this, again, really goes back to what kind of resources does the hospital have, how quickly is it able to turn over, and are there available devices to purchase?
Yeah. It's comforting that very practical resources are emerging for the healthcare industry. But Greg, this isn't an issue that's unique to healthcare. And frequently we can pull from other industries and learn from their experience. So tell us about cybersecurity in other industry sectors.
Absolutely. But before I do that, though, I want to pick up on what Erick said about a cookbook. A friend of mine would say that when we talk about supply chain and information sharing and progress in this area, it's better to be at the table than to be on the menu. If you're on the menu, you're going to get chewed up by the cyber attackers and by the regulators. So it's important in the Health Sector Coordinating Council to come to the table like Erick and Kevin did in leading. Erick's group had more than 150 organizations participating in the hiccup. Kevin's group had more than 50 organizations participating in the Joint Security Plan. And specifically on the supply chain security for vendors, the supply chain security issue is something that is on the minds of all of those other critical industry sectors, whether it's IT, financial services, or electricity. They've been going at this a lot longer in a sense because cyber attacks because those industry sectors have been a much bigger target over the years than has the health sector, which is really just more recent. Financial services, Willie Sutton robs banks because that's where the money is. And the electric sector is a huge supply chain security problem. And I'll give you one example. When I was the Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity at the Department of Homeland Security, we wanted to test the resiliency and security of the electric grid by staging a mock cyber attack on an electric generator. You all can look this up. You can Google cyber attack on electric generator, and you'll see what we did is attack a very small item in the supply chain of an electric generator. It's called a protective relay. It's either open or it's closed. And we changed the flow of electricity into and out of it such that we threw the rotating gears out of sync, which caused a massive multi-ton generator to shudder and shake and literally go up in smoke. This was a supply chain security problem because as more and more electric generators become connected over the internet or over networks, they become therefore more vulnerable. We didn't cause a blackout with this cyber attack, but we turned into a brick a major electric generator. You can't just go down to Home Depot and pull one off the shelf. So this is an example of where supply chain security really is critical for maintaining the security and resiliency of any enterprise.
Just like that. So talk a bit about the government's stake in all of this, and specifically as it relates to healthcare.
Really good question. First of all, the government is one of the biggest customers for healthcare and for electricity and financial services. So they have a customer's stake in the outcome of security and resiliency of the products and services that they purchase. That is their responsibility as managing America's tax-paying dollars. Second of all, where there is not always a regulatory solution to some of these problems, the government can step in and serve as a convening authority. Right? They can bring people to the table, bring them to the table so they're not on the menu, and get them to work through some of those difficult and complex issues that face a complex industry like healthcare, and try to come up with collaborative solutions. And the third is intelligence. Intelligence and information sharing, whether it's law enforcement or national security intelligence. Government has the ability to inform industry about emerging, impending threats, the motivations of criminal gangs in other countries or national security, nation-state espionage intentions. And having that level of awareness, the industry is forewarned and therefore forearmed.
So let's just dig in a little bit and roll up our sleeves. So transition from the macro to the micro. And Erick at UCM, tell us a bit about your partnership within the health system and how you have specifically leveraged contracting to reinforce cybersecurity at your organization.
Should I roll up my sleeves?
Go for it. Let's do it.
I think first and foremost, there's no need to reinvent the wheel on this. There's no need to have pride of authorship associated to the types of cybersecurity practices that you're implementing. And so for the supply chain side of the house, actually working with partners like you to get into the meat of how we bring devices in and how we bring technology in, one of the first issues is what types of contracts are we going to put in place and what kind of terms are going to be part of that. So given the fact that there is no pride of authorship, I stole from Kevin. and I stole from Mayo. And that's fine because they had a fantastic security schedule that we were able to take in, and for the 90% of it, it's roughly the same. We did adjust it for about the 10% that needed to be tailored to our specific needs, but that's fine. That's the purpose of the joint collaboration and allowing all of us to work better to increase the whole. So, some specific things that we put into the contracting. Kevin mentioned this earlier about the FDA post-market guidance, that it states when you open it up that it's a non-binding document. It's a constant conversation that we have with our manufacturers and you as the supply chain people. I'm sure those who have been doing the cybersecurity work are getting this type of pushback, like, well, we don't have to do the FDA guidance because it's called guidance. Well, guidance means something very specific in the government and within HHS. So we put those terms directly into the contract to just negate the entire conversation. We want this to be about do these provisions, make these outcomes available, and we all need to raise the bar collectively as an industry. But it's also important to note, so that's the contracting side. That's how your supply chain people can help you out. And what we've done at U Chicago Medicine, working in partnership with the supply chain folks, we went through the process of establishing that process to have that hook come over to the cybersecurity office and allow us the opportunity to comment and negotiate with the vendors. Lastly, two other points. It's important that you do the right assessments when you're bringing in these devices. Take the MDS2s that the manufacturer should be supplying you, and that actually should be one of the questions in the supply chain process is give us your MDS2 so we can evaluate it. And in the MDS2, what that does is it lists out all the various security controls that the particular product can actually meet. And then it's on you as the provider to make sure that you take that and then implement it, but build it into your architecture, put it into your process, and actually make it a reality. It's one thing to contract, it's another thing to actually turn it into the real life. And lastly, I would be remiss if as an author and leader of the development of Hiccup that we didn't apply it. So we absolutely are taking that product, that cookbook, and figuring out which recipes we want to apply within UCM.
So just circling back specifically to supply chain professionals, what steps could they begin taking today, our viewers, to hardwire these protections within their organizations?
Yeah, awesome question. And the first thing I would suggest is go find your CISO, go find your cybersecurity people, and make friends. It really is a team sport in this. It's supply chain, it's legal, it's IT, it's cyber. Kevin mentioned this earlier. Greg was talking about it as well. And we all have to know that we're in this game together. We're all trying to achieve the same outcome. I think that's some of the first hesitation is we got a lot of work that we have to do. We got a lot of things that we got to get through. We don't want to slow it down. We understand and we respect that. So it's important that you build out the process and you put good gates in the process that allows for the supply chain people to do what the supply chain people are excellent at, allows for the cybersecurity people to come in and do the things that they're excellent at and work as a team to deliver better protections to your organization. Some things that specifically you can do, make sure that you get these cybersecurity standards built into your RFI and RFP mechanisms. And then if you're not, we don't do RFIs and RFPs for every single thing that we buy. So all the general contracting as well, just get those terms in there, get aligned with your security folks and make sure that your process is well sustained. And just note, again, like I said before, we're all in this together and we all have an expectation of being able to get through the exercise of understanding the security issues with these devices as we bring them in. So just be partners as we're doing that, and don't forget to do the develop and execute on your security assessments within these medical devices themselves.
And sometimes we make these things way too complicated. You really need to stick with some high-value, simple to understand security standards to begin with. And these are things that, whether it's a medical device, whether it's an IT device, whether it's a your home computer again, there's like 6 requirements that if you are able to instantiate into your purchasing process will make a significant difference. And they're just things like running a supported operating system. You can patch that operating system. There's antivirus or whitelisting. You can patch your third-party software, no default and hard-coded passwords. And again, these are things that you need to partner with your supply chain on. And again, if we in security are not coming to you, it's really important for you to go to them. The other part is for the supply chain professionals. You really need to be vigilant in the contracting process and hold the vendors accountable. You'll find a lot of the stuff that you buy with medical devices won't even meet those sort of 6 basic low-level type of things. But that's okay. You still have to treat patients, and this is a negotiation. So it's okay to put time frames in place for contracts, and then once it's in the contract, you can hold it to them. And again, make sure that your risk assessment process is in line with your contracting process. So for small, low-risk devices, even hospitals and healthcare facilities, which are on the lower end of risk because of the types of patients they treat or where they're located, you want to tailor this to the kind of risk that your hospital either has or the device has.
And it isn't just the vendors that we want to hold accountable, it's also your own enterprise. I was at a hospital recently where in the cardiology unit, the chief cardiologist had his own electronic health record system, and the rest of the hospital had a completely different one because he was a rock star and he got to choose the EHR that he wanted. That's a no-no in good supply chain security. You have to have a uniform and structured process for buying IT and for assessing it. And I'm happy to point out a little teaser that the Health Sector Council Cyber Working Group will be releasing later on in the summer a field deployable toolkit, not so much about in supply chain security, not so much about the security controls you need to be demanding of your vendors, but what is the structure, what is the organizational structure you need to establish within your provider hospital to be sure that you take into account all of the equities, whether, as Erick said earlier, it involves the legal counsel, it involves IT, it involves security, it involves procurement, the CTO. You need to have a structured process. And so we're putting out a toolkit that advises particularly small and mid-sized hospitals that are less resourced. What's the best way to do that? So we're going to need your feedback on that. I would urge all these supply chain professionals to get involved in the Sector Coordinating Council, and if not able to participate or contribute directly, to give us feedback, to kick the tires of toolkits like this to make sure it works for your enterprise.
Yeah, and we're going to make several of those resources very directly available to our audience later in the program, and it's really interesting to me the additional consideration that this presents for unwarranted clinical variation. Mm-hmm. There are really, it just further reinforces the need to address that within our provider organization. So we are going to transition to questions now. It's time for you guys to get involved. If you're participating live on the internet, just type in your question and submit it, and we'll pull those up here. We've had a few come in the course of our conversation. So an interesting question about the partnership with IT, and we have a viewer thinking about that pretty specifically out there today. So Erick, can you just discuss the partnership between supply chain and IT before and after the implantation of a medical device?
Oh, sure. So it's actually twofold. It's a life cycle. So before you get the medical device, obviously it's important to make sure that you have the contracting that we talked about before and all of the elements applied within those terms, the terms and conditions associated to the contract. When the device comes in and it's inside your environment, supply chain is also a choke point for communication that the manufacturers might have as it relates to recalls or other types of safety events that happen. So you want to establish that relationship as well with your security people to make sure that as notices, vulnerabilities are being disclosed, et cetera, it's going to go through your clinical engineering, it's going to go through your biomedical engineering, it's also going to go through your supply chain folks to make sure that you understand where these particular devices are actually embedded in patients or being used by patients. And so that partnership with supply chain to security is a two-way street that allows us as the security professionals to be able to evaluate what is the impact that we have when a particular type of notice presents itself.
Got it.
And that partnership will grow over time. It's interesting as you start to partner with your health technology management, if you start to partner with your supply chain and start putting those things in the contracts. Supply chain management aren't cybersecurity experts. Security is not supply chain experts. So there's a ramp-up time of where those groups really have to participate together and get the cybersecurity people involved in some of the contract negotiations and develop an understanding of what's happening, what the outcomes are, and be prepared as well when you start talking about cybersecurity terms and conditions. Vendors are not actually really up to speed on how to do that, and so pretty soon, you're talking to your local sales guy who has no clue, and then they try to pull in sort of the geek from the back room to get in on those contract negotiations, and sometimes you have to be a bit patient.
And one of the things we're hoping that the hospital systems will be asking their vendors are you aligned with the Health Sector Council's Joint Security Plan? Because that's the guidance for the vendors and that's the guidance for the hospitals, that you're getting that alignment between vendor and customer so that we can actually have more uniformity in the way we think about the security of medical devices.
I'll tell you, Greg, one of the things that we're going to be doing is we have embedded in our contract terms the FDA guidance. Now we're going to be looking at the Joint Security Plan and figuring out how we can hold the manufacturers accountable to that.
Excellent. So related to that discussion, Kevin, can you speak a bit more, and this is a question that has come in, about your work with Vizient and safeguards that you guys are exploring?
So part, as I mentioned earlier, this really to move the whole market, it's going to take some market shoving by HDOs asking. It's going to take some regulation, working with group purchasing organizations, working with regulators. And so one of the things that we've done is spent a lot of time with Vizient to try to bake a lot of these things into their group purchasing contracts as well. So it's really a fascinating idea to think, instead of just sort of Mayo demanding it, now Vizient for 50% of the hospitals in the United States now have these cybersecurity requirements and contract built into their RFI, their RFP, and their contracting processes. It's a big force multiplier for a lot of this.
Got it. So getting even more granular on that for Erick and Kevin, if you were to recommend, a singular, most significant contract term related to cybersecurity, what would it be? That's a question from our viewers.
I can't give you, if you were really, really pin me down to just one.
Yes.
just one. It would be that it has a operating system which is current and can be updated.
Got it.
Back to I mentioned those 6 things before. If you look at the Australian Signal Directorate, if you look at the SANS top 20, those things have been shown to take some 80% of your cybersecurity risk, 80+% of your cybersecurity risk off the table. And again, those are not profound things. It's a little hard to have a vendor argue that I should keep a supported operating system on my computer, which runs the device.
No-brainer, right?
Well, I'll give you 2 because it's hard to pin on one.
Got it.
I did.
All right. Well,
No
I'll give you the most effective one, which was when we took the FDA post-market guidance and said you have to apply this, you have to adhere to the post-market guidance, and then we actually broke up the elements of the post-market guidance that we thought was most important: a coordinated vulnerability management disclosure program, participation in the ISACs. The controlled risk and uncontrolled risk. This is getting very technical here about what it is, but that was really important because when we're looking at an uncontrolled risk in the FDA world, post-market guidance world, that means that it's a risk to patient safety. There's specific timeframes that they outlined within the guidance. Within 30 days, you need to notify the organizations that there's a problem and provide compensating controls. Within 60 days, you need to fix it. We still have vendors in place today that have not determined that the vulnerability that Wannacry exploited was an uncontrolled risk. They consider that, some of them consider that to be a controlled risk. despite the fact that we had a national health system in the UK completely get shut down, and very seriously ill patients could not get treated because the treatment capabilities were not available to them. So it's really important that we turn that dialogue around and say, this is really, really important.
Right, absolutely. This conversation completely reinforces that today. So Greg, a question for you. One of our viewers has an interest in getting involved in the public-private partnership. How can the broader array of providers and even supply chain leaders participate in some of the public-private collaboration?
Good question. Glad you asked that. The first thing to do is just simply go to the website, healthsectorcouncil.org, and you can express your interest that way, and we will get back to you immediately. There is no cost to join the Sector Coordinating Council. The only cost is your sweat equity, that you need to come to the table with the ability to contribute, and again, if not to contribute, then to be able to implement and operationalize some of the work that we are providing to the Health Sector Council, to the health industry. This is your responsibility. This is critical infrastructure. The healthcare industry is critical infrastructure. And the problems that we face are bigger than each individual component of that industry. So please come to the table. There's a lot of work to be done with a lot of different expertise that is necessary, and supply chain security is central to a lot of it. So thanks for the question.
Yeah. Well, that is the time that we have, and I just want to express the most sincere gratitude for taking time out of your day to be with us. Clearly, you have plenty to work on. This is so significant. If we didn't get to your question, we will follow up with you by email to make sure that you get an answer. Again, just tremendous insight and expertise, and very broad contributions to the industry at large. So special thank you again to Erick and Kevin and Greg for your leadership. So all of our guests, and again, these are tremendous resources for you to tap into. Their email addresses are provided for you on screen, and they're also in your handout. And we've referenced a few extremely helpful resources in the course of today's discussion, but specifically, those would be HICCUP, the JSP, and the post-market guidance on cybersecurity and medical devices from the FDA. Tremendous resources you can pull from, and as you heard today, very directly, specifically incorporate into contract language to hardwire these protections within your organizations. Also, a couple reminders about upcoming educational opportunities related to cybersecurity. We'll have a series of webinars on cybersecurity coming up this spring, and we'll actually circle back on this topic with another webcast later in the course of 2019, and those details are available in your handout. Our next program within the Supply Chain Leadership Series in May is specific to transforming procurement through strategy, and specifically exploring an opportunity to merge clinical value analysis roles and responsibilities with contracting roles and responsibilities, and Rush University Medical Center will join us. So don't miss it. As always, don't forget to fill out your evaluations, because your feedback is extremely important as we're planning future programs. And I'm Molly Zmuda. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you guys.